Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's my great pleasure to welcome today Dr. Alex Pomson. Alex is the principal and managing director of Rossov Consulting, which does work around the globe in Jewish education, connection with communities. And most recently, he was a co-author with Jack Westheimer of a book of studies of Jewish schools called Inside Jewish Day Schools, Leadership, Learning, and Community. And it's a pleasure to welcome Alex today. And I thank you not only for joining me, but I also thank you for all of the work you've done. I'm a big fan, and I've been following so much of what you've been able to contribute to the field. So thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is mutual, so very happy to have this conversation.
Well, it's great. I really just want to go straight to the book, actually, for a minute. It was published by Brandeis, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. It is a serious book, even though it reads just like an interesting book. And they're case studies of schools. One of the schools is a Chicago school, Hillel Torah. And you present those case studies. What did you learn out of the book?
Right. Well, my children tell me that it is the most interesting book I've written so far. So that is an important judgment. And I think, there are many things we learned. We try and summarize those things in the conclusion. And I would say is that what we try to do there is make explicit what we see as the primary contributions of Jewish day schools to the lives of their students. And perhaps going beyond that, and less obviously, we try and spell out what Jewish day schools contribute to parents and to the broader community. They're often seen as islands, isolated, separatist institutions. And what we found in the 9 very different schools that we looked at was just how great the contribution of Jewish day schools can be, not only to those who attend, pay the fees, but also to those in the broader community who may not have children or grandchildren in the school.
Is it the kind of book that we can hand to somebody and say, this is why you need to be in favor of Jewish education?
I would hope so. I would say we didn't set out to write a PR piece on behalf of Jewish day school education. We knew that we wanted to study functioning schools. There didn't seem much point to go and look at schools that were on the verge of closing or that were in the midst of some kind of turmoil. We really wanted to see what Jewish day schools are capable of doing when run well. So maybe we stacked the deck in that way. But really, I think, what came out, what emerged from this is evidence, hard evidence of just what can happen when a Jewish day school is well run and what kind of learning can occur in those schools. Yes.
So what was the most surprising finding that you had from the study? And I'm sure there were many, but what surprised you the most?
Right. I would say how much schools share with one another despite the remarkable differences between them. So to take maybe 2 extremes, the largest school in the sample and the smallest school. The largest school in the sample was Darchei Torah. It's a yeshiva in Far Rockaway, just outside New York.
Rabbi Bender's.
Sorry?
Rabbi Bender is the...
Rabbi Bender School, yes. Exactly. Rabbi Bender School. It's a school with more than 2,000 students, all of them male, from the age of 3 to 23 or something, right? And it's a school where in the Masifta, in the high school, maybe 3 hours a day, 2.5 hours a day are devoted to general studies, right? That's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum would be the Akiva School in Nashville, Tennessee. At the time we studied the school, there were maybe 75, 80 students. And the school was inclusive of everybody who was being raised as a Jew in Nashville. 2 very, very different institutions. And yet there were a series of common denominators that reflected, let's say, the Jewish character of the school and the educational dimensions of the school and what accounted for each of those schools' successes in ways that kind of lead one to feel that we often think that the Jewish day school system is fragmented. We don't have anything to say to one another. There's a great deal we share. There are many challenges we share, and we would benefit from talking with one another I mean, in many ways, I think that was the most surprising thing.
That's interesting. Darchei Torah, I wouldn't imagine typically would really be open to having a researcher who's a vice chancellor of JTS, Jack
yes,
Wertheimer, and yourself.
yeah, yeah.
How did you get to those schools?
Right. So I would say, well, with difficulty, but you know, we asked around. Like, so how do we identify any of the schools? But we really asked people which schools would they regard as interesting and worth investigating. And a colleague at Yeshiva University, whose name I'm blocking on now, Moshe Krakowski.
A Chicago fellow.
Okay,
Yeah.
so he recommended a few Haredi schools as possibly receptive. Yeshiva Darchei Torah was the only one that opened the doors, and I went to visit Rabbi Bender. I was expecting to have to make a lengthy pitch, and within a couple of minutes he said, "Why wouldn't we want you to come in? We have nothing to be ashamed of." And that was it. That was really it. And I must say, I felt that, you know, the time, this was a school that only I visited actually, and I was welcomed, was able to have, you know, particularly memorably, you know, I spent one day following Rabbi Bender from the start of his day to the end of the day. He's the Rosh Yeshiva, he's been a Rosh Yeshiva for 40 years or something. And with his permission, I was able to sit in during the afternoon from about 3 in the afternoon to 7 in the evening. Something that he does pretty much every day is kind of appointments with people in the broader community who have issues they want to bring to him. And many of them were sensitive, difficult issues. And he was willing to open the door and have someone look over his shoulder, really. So really,
he's an amazing educator. And so it's good that all of those possibilities were there. But it's not the only study you've done. We were speaking a few weeks ago, you and I, you were talking about a longitudinal study you're doing of British day school students. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
With pleasure. So this is a study supported by the Pears Foundation in the UK that is looking at the development of young people who have attended Jewish day schools. And conveniently, we launched the study when these young people were just starting what they call secondary school in the UK, which in the UK is 7th grade, year 7. All of these children were essentially born just before or after the year 2000. So they were 10 years old starting school. That was in 2010. And with the support of the foundation, we have been following the children in 7 mainstream Jewish high schools, 6 in London, 1 in Manchester, and their parents. Ever since, we surveyed the children every 2 years. We interviewed their parents every 2 years. And of the 150 families that we were interviewing at the beginning, we still have just over 100 families still willing to talk to us. We don't have quite as many students as we started out responding to surveys. There are more than 1,000 at the beginning. We have about 300 now. But what's been really powerful is to see the ways in which these children have emerged from day schools and had to face life in university. Some of them have made Aliyah. A couple of them are now married. And we're able to ask them about, explore the ways in which, or what has contributed to the Jewish lives they lead today. Yeah.
So what is core? In other words, we talk about the community. There's the community, there are the parents, there's the friends, and there's the school. Mm-hmm. Can a day school operate when all of those other pieces of the system are not in place? If a family is not supportive of a day school mission, do day schools have a chance of being successful, or a reasonable chance of being successful? If a child is living in a non-Jewish neighborhood, if they don't have Jewish friends to support, or is the day school supportive of what is in place and can add to?
Right. So I think from that longitudinal study, without any question, we observe just how powerful the influence of family is, right? But our family is not a straitjacket, right? I think that, analogy from a scholar is like family provides you with the cards. The question is how you play those cards, right? And schools can help you play those cards more smartly than you might otherwise know how to. And you might have more success in the game of life, even if the cards that you were given at the start were not the best possible cards. You may still be able to make a success of those circumstances. So without any question, we are seeing in the longitudinal study how much influence not just parents, but extended families have on the developmental trajectories of young people, right? But at the same time, there's no question that schools make a contribution, and that contribution may be less explicit or less intended, in the sense that schools bring together young people in a kind of hothouse for a period of time, and they create an environment in which these young people influence one another, right? Apart from any contribution their educators may make. So I think like the contribution of both educators and one's peers during those day school years can set people off on trajectories that are different from those that might have been predicted by their home circumstances.
So taking your analogy of the deck of cards, I'm not
Yeah.
going too far into a poker game. If the parents give the deck of cards, the school gives strategies,
Mhm.
the friends create the game in which they're playing, I guess.
In a sense, yeah.
Have you been able to determine what's the strongest variable in terms of future involvement, commitment, religiosity?
I don't know that we've been able to tease these things apart. There's no question that family really makes that difference. If we're talking about the school, most people have a story about a teacher that made a difference, right? Most people talk about, they would single out a teacher who really made an impact, right? They don't necessarily talk about the teachers, right? There are usually individuals that young children connect with, young people connect with. So I think that's part of it. I think another piece of it is the extent to which schools provide opportunities for young people to become empowered in their own Jewish lives, like making a bit of space, like kind of the tzimtzum concept, like step back so that, and have the confidence that these young people can make the right decisions. Going back to the day school book, something very compelling that one of the heads of schools, Rabbi Ami Newman, said to me from the JEC in the Masifta, in the Rav Tate's Masifta in Elizabeth, that's right. He said to me, like, his job is to ensure that his students don't make the wrong decisions, but or harmful decisions, but he wants them to make those decisions, right? And he wants to give them the best resources to make decisions, to make responsible decisions. So I think like it's a combination of the individual educator who truly connects with a child, and the school creating opportunities for young people to really gain skills, gain a capacity to lead responsible Jewish lives, basically.
But what you're describing would seem to suggest a change of curriculum. Because you're talking about social emotional learning, you're talking about learning of leadership, learning of decision making, you're talking about relationships with teachers.
Right.
Based on what you're finding, how does it fit into our typical academic model?
Right.
Where there's Tanakh and there's Gemara and there's Ivrit and then all of the academic subjects as well.
Right. These are all part of the equation. So I have a piece that hopefully will be coming out soon with the Sapir magazine journal, where I basically argue that Jewish day schools promise three things to families. They promise to enable their children to become cultural virtuosos, by which I mean they'll be literate, they'll be able to communicate to a certain degree in Hebrew, they'll know how to act properly in Jewish situations. They'll be able to produce Jewish culture in ways that most Jews are not able to do today. That's one thing. A second thing is that they promise community, and we've talked about that quite a bit already. And the last thing is really is kind of a fancy word for it would be kind of personal actualization. They enable a child to become the best version of themselves, right? And so in some ways that's the social emotional piece of this. It's also an intellectual piece of this. That all three of those things are, the day school promises. Whether they will deliver those things is, I think open to question, right? Some do a better job than others, obviously, but I think they all have the potential to do those things. There are tensions there's a tension between building community and cultivating virtuosos. It's like it's difficult to really enable people to get ahead and succeed in difficult ways if you're a truly inclusive institution, right? And not everybody has the same aptitudes in the classroom. Like there are tensions built into this system for sure. But those are the outcomes in many ways.
So the virtuoso is really culturally literate. We do
Yes.
pretty well, I think. But virtuoso, there was one of the challenges we have in the United States, and I think it's almost throughout the world today with Jewish education, is we have democratized Jewish education. It's no longer an education for elite.
Right.
So you will have in the same base medrash people who know how to sit and people who know how to learn.
Yeah.
You'll have all these multiple levels of classrooms. So if I'm trying to create that virtuoso, I don't necessarily have those inherent challenges because everyone has access.
Right.
Is that something we should be concerned about, or is cultural literacy sufficient?
Well, what you're describing is certainly a real challenge. I think again, like among the schools that we studied, we saw evidence of how it isn't all or nothing. Is that you can create spaces that enable young people to become virtuosos of a certain kind that are still inclusive of others for whom maybe the goal is literacy of some or in some fashion. Serving the needs of one group of children doesn't have to come at the expense of the other. And in some ways, more than in some ways, in many ways, being able to achieve such outcomes across a diversity of children communicates a very powerful message, musa, really, about what Jewish community involves, and that providing opportunities for some to excel in Jewish learning doesn't have to come at the expense of the rest of the community. It's a community enterprise.
No, and it's a greater challenge. I've seen in schools today the number of therapists, special educators, all of the student services that are necessary have expanded in ways that I don't think I would have ever imagined. When I first became head of school at Ida Crown, we didn't have a social worker. One of my first hires was to hire a social worker. And today we have a full suite of academic specialists who work with students in their classrooms, outside their classrooms. It's a continuing development. I think it's part of the American scene in general of all of the specialties that are necessary. And I think we've also gone from life is more complicated today.
Yep. Yeah.
Is the model we use going to work long term, or do we have to look at shifting things?
No, I think the model you're describing does explain why and how Jewish day schools have evolved in the ways that they have. I mean, one of the impetuses for doing this recent study of the 9 schools was our joint sense of how different Jewish day schools are today from how they were 20 or 30 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. And part of what has been very significant in that change is the degree to which they are now resourced in ways that meet the needs of diverse students. So it isn't just social workers anymore. There are all kinds of learning specialists that are on the roster. And that change has come with a price, literally with a price. Like, it's not surprising that Jewish day school tuition has accelerated in the ways that it has. If people's needs are going to be met, those services come at a price. I would just say that, recently, the experience of Jewish day schools during COVID has offered some indication that the investment schools made over the last 20 years gained some recognition, really, among the quite high number of transfers from public schools into Jewish day schools, among people who never previously imagined they would attend a Jewish day school. So our firm did a study about a year ago for Prisma that looked at, we interviewed more than 100 of these transfer families, right? And many of them said, I never considered a Jewish day school previously because I didn't imagine it would be a child-centered institution. I assumed my child might be brainwashed in this institution. There wouldn't be enough diversity in the school for me. And I was surprised. We were surprised when it came to the point that we were realizing our children weren't getting a good enough education remotely in our public school. We need to take a second look at the Jewish day school. And these are the things they found there.
It's amazing how nimble the Jewish day schools were for sometimes stodgy institutions, how we were able to transform what we were doing so quickly. If you had a chance to study something in the Jewish world to understand it better, to bring wisdom to everyone else, what area do you think we need to be looking at?
Wow.
I just gave you a grant. You can study anything you want. What do you want to do?
Well, I'm kind of addicted to longitudinal studies, right? What people call cohort studies. And the work that we did in the UK that has looked at a population that shares one thing in common, Jewish day school education. I would love to be able to do something similar in the US, but not limited to Jewish day school families, but essentially to create a generational sample of young kids who are being raised in Jewish homes. We don't know where they're going to be educated, and we simply want to be able to follow them in a kind of natural experiment over the next 20, 30 years to try and observe the contribution of different Jewish educational experiences to the ways that their lives evolve. Those kinds of studies have been carried out in the broader society, particularly driven by concerns about health, but sometimes by concerns about education. And life course studies, as they're known, can really shed light on those elements in a human being's experience that make the greatest difference to their lives. And if we were able to do this, I think we'd be a lot wiser.
What do you think you would find, though, if you were taking that study of people, Jewish education, not Jewish education, just young Jews, 30 years hence? What kinds of things do you think you'd find?
Well, I'm prejudiced. My work until now suggests to me that the Jewish day school is probably the most powerful vehicle we have for Jewish education. Jewish summer camps for sure perform a certain function and do extremely powerful work. Experiences in Israel, likewise. But I think we would find that this is kind of stating the obvious, perhaps. But the more intensive and the more sustained the Jewish educational experience, the more likely the more intense the Jewish outcomes will be. The greater the Jewish outcomes. I mean that's a fairly basic equation. but I think what would be most interesting would be to try and uncover the surprises. So like those who don't experience these things, what happens to them, and how do they beat the odds, as it were? Like what are those factors that might contribute to
Years
supporting
ago,
it?
Andrew Greeley did a study at the University of Chicago in
Uh-huh.
terms of the amount of Catholic education that made a difference.
Uh-huh.
Harold
Yeah.
Himmelfarb paralleled that. Greeley
Yeah.
was an
Yeah.
advisor.
Yeah.
Same thing with Jewish education. And when he
Yeah.
discovered there was a certain amount,
Right.
that it plateaued,
Yeah.
then it
Yeah.
went higher again. And
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
it went higher again was really where Jewish day school
Right.
education would ever
Right.
jump into the
Right.
fray.
Right. Right. I mean, that work has been questioned over the years because it, it basically isolates dosage, quantity, right? And it doesn't really take into account quality or the particular context in which those hours are accumulated. And I would say, like, my own thinking about cultural virtuosos comes from reading about our people who've been successful in many areas of cultural life, whether it's the Beatles or Bill Gates. The number of hours these folks invested in the garage or in the woodshed or whatever it is, getting good at those things that they ended up excelling in, does suggest that a certain amount of investment is necessary. Like, you do need to spend time on getting these things right.
Like that's also Bloom on mastery education and mastery
Right.
learning. Same that
Right.
there's a certain number of years that were necessary for Olympic
Yeah.
athletes. So
Right.
looking at our Jewish world today in the United States, for example, and our Jewish educational world, what do you think is the biggest thing we need to be better at?
Oh. Okay, I mean, the flippant answer to that was we need to get better at lowering the price of admission to Jewish educational experiences. That is truly a challenge, right? Our quality experiences come at a price, and we've got to be careful of pricing ourselves out of the market. And I suppose, like, if we want to do better, I mean, there are some outstanding programs or outstanding experiences. If people can't afford to access them, that's a terrible waste. So yes, that's not a flippant answer. As I think about it, that's a pretty serious
That's pretty
answer.
good. It's also
Yeah.
one of the good answers of why Aliyah seems to be rising.
Uh-huh. Right.
The cost of Jewish day schools is significant, but but what's interesting is in the Orthodox world, at least, I believe that even with the costs of Jewish day schools, there's been a way that the community, because it's considered a core necessity, has figured out how to make it work.
Right. Right.
In the non-Orthodox world, is there a price point?
Right. I mean, that's really a fascinating question. We did a different study, did a study in Toronto on behalf of the Federation and the community high school there that was seeing a decline in enrollment from, let's say, 2005 through 2017, 18. And we surveyed families whose children were currently in Jewish elementary school in the city. And those schools had seen a decline in the number of kids transitioning to the high schools, the community high school. And there was a price point. We identified that if the school lowered the fees by 25%, it would see an increase in enrollment of maybe 50%.
Wow.
And the community found a couple of funders to make that possible. And to their credit, 5 years on, those are the numbers. There was absolutely a price sensitivity to what had become an inflated tuition price tag. So it isn't, we can talk about it in abstract terms, but there probably is a number in many cases for, you're not going to win everybody over. I can, tell you about a different study in a different community where, we were asking people, what would it take? How much would we lower the price? It barely made a dent because the school was already being priced at a very competitive level. And, other than offering free education that competes with free public education, you weren't going to really make a difference. But in this case, you were talking to Jewish day school families whose children had been in day school until 8th grade and basically said, I can't afford to keep going. Right.
Wow. And unfortunately, our time is up, but this last point is really supports the reason why we need research and the kind of research that you've been doing and that Rasav Consulting has been doing. So I thank you so much for that. I thank you for your voice in so many important areas in the Jewish educational world. And I encourage everybody, if they have a chance, check out the book, Inside Jewish Day Schools, Leadership, Learning, and Community. This isn't a pitched, an advertisement. It's just a reality. It's got some really fascinating information, and it's available Brandeis University, or this thing called Amazon that some of you may know. It's available as well. Alex, I thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom, and I wish you a very good evening and a very good day.
Thank you. Be well. All right. Bye-bye.